Muito boa tarde. Pedia que, por favor, que ocupassem os vossos lugares. Obrigada. Boa tarde de novo, bem-vindos à apresentação do estudo Resourcing Higher Education in Portugal. Desde o início da atual legislatura, o Ministério da Ciência, Tecnologia e Ensino Superior comprometeu-se com a avaliação do modelo de financiamento do ensino superior nacional. O relatório, que a Organização para a Cooperação e Desenvolvimento Económico nos apresenta, resulta do pedido de Portugal à OCDE para avaliar a melhor metodologia de financiamento das nossas instituições académicas. Para dar início à sessão, dou a palavra ao Presidente da Academia das Ciências de Lisboa, José Luís Cardoso.
Senhora Ministra da Ciência, Tecnologia e Ensino Superior, Professora Elvira Fortunato, Sr. Secretário de Estado do Ensino Superior, Professor Pedro Teixeira, Senhores Reitores de Universidades e Presidentes de Politécnicos e seus representantes que se encontram nesta sessão, Senhoras e Senhores representantes das diversas instituições do ensino superior, dos serviços do Ministério e da FCT também presentes. Cumprimento especialmente os peritos da OCDE, Simon Roy e Ana Moreno Monroy. My apologies for not speaking in English, but I was told that you understand perfectly Portuguese, so I'll do it in Portuguese. Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, bem-vindos à Academia das Ciências de Lisboa, local escolhido pela Senhora Ministra e pelo Sr. Secretário de Estado para a apresentação e o início da discussão pública do relatório da OCDE sobre financiamento do ensino superior. Como anfitrião, cumpre-me assinalar a honra que é sempre para a Academia das Ciências de Lisboa acolher sessões públicas que assinalam momentos de especial significado para a reflexão e a decisão em matérias de definição de políticas públicas, neste caso de políticas de ensino superior, com especial enfoque nas questões do financiamento e, certamente, na própria organização e estruturação do setor. Como Presidente desta instituição, não posso deixar de aproveitar o momento para reafirmar a disponibilidade da Academia das Ciências para ser um interlocutor interessado, crítico e independente na apreciação do relatório que vai ser apresentado e do qual eu ainda não tenho conhecimento. Falo com essa vantagem de não ter conhecimento do relatório. Tal como certamente a quase generalidade ou a maioria dos presentes, não conheço o conteúdo e as conclusões do relatório da OCDE, coordenado por Simon Roy, e não posso, por isso, tecer quaisquer considerações a esse respeito. Mas seremos aqui na Academia leitores atentos deste relatório. A experiência da produção de relatórios por peritos da OCDE sobre o sistema de ensino superior em Portugal e a qualidade técnica dos documentos que têm produzido tornam obrigatória a nossa atenção para os elementos de diagnóstico e recomendações apresentadas. E aqui faço esta declaração de vontade e de interesse em ser leitor atento deste documento pelos ensinamentos que colhi na análise que fiz do anterior relatório produzido pela OCDE e disponibilizado em fevereiro de 2018, cujas recomendações, salvo melhor opinião, não foram merecedoras da atenção que justificava. Refiro-me, em particular, às recomendações sobre a articulação governamental de políticas relacionadas com a inovação e desenvolvimento, sobretudo entre o Ministério da Ciência, Tecnologia e Ensino Superior e o Ministério da Economia, à inadequação ou à fraca autonomia da estrutura orgânica e funcional da FCT, à ausência de preparação de uma estratégia nacional para o conhecimento e inovação em Portugal, às fragilidades do enquadramento legal, institucional e financeiro do sistema, os obstáculos do RGES, o relativo fracasso do sistema fundacional, o desvio de missão de algumas universidades que ocupam os territórios de formação dos politécnicos, os erros associados ao modelo fórmula de financiamento e tantos outros aspectos que eram apontados neste importante relatório da OCDE de 2018. Também a deficiente articulação entre oferta educativa, formação vocacional e formação ao longo da vida, o modo de organização dos programas doutorais e o eventual papel dos institutos politécnicos neste domínio. Os riscos da política de emprego científico, não obstante a bondade das intenções de oferecer garantias contratuais, no momento em que as primeiras medidas estavam a ser postas em prática e cujos efeitos ameaçam ser, 5 anos envolvidos, uma enorme dor de cabeça para quem exerce funções de responsabilidade na gestão das instituições do ensino superior. Esses eram aspectos desse relatório que eu acho que continuam a merecer muita atenção. Foi assim o relatório de 2018. E só posso esperar e desejar que este novo relatório de 2022 traga novos elementos de diagnóstico e novas recomendações que obriguem a pensar o que não está bem e que nos conduzam a soluções de melhoria do funcionamento com vista à satisfação de objetivos ambiciosos. Estes relatórios são um desafio para quem governa, porque antecipam o escrutínio que terá de ser feito sobre o modo como se responde às recomendações apresentadas. Nem todas poderão ou deverão ser atendidas, mas é importante que se saiba porquê. Estou certo que a Sra. Ministra, o Sr. Secretário de Estado e demais responsáveis das universidades e dos institutos politécnicos saberão tirar deste relatório os ensinamentos que permitam introduzir desejadas e indispensáveis melhorias no sistema de ensino superior em Portugal. O parecer e o aconselhamento de peritos internacionais representam uma prática de avaliação e de aconselhamento internacional que muito deve à dinâmica de José Maria Negago, que introduziu uma nova cultura nas instituições de ciência e tecnologia em Portugal. A Academia das Ciências de Lisboa marcará presença neste debate que agora se inicia. Muito obrigado pela participação de todos nesta sessão.
Dou a palavra ao Secretário de Estado do Ensino Superior, Pedro Nuno Teixeira.
Sra. Ministra da Ciência e Tecnologia do Ensino Superior, cara Elvira Fortunato, Sr. Professor José Luís Cardoso, Presidente da Academia das Ciências, muito obrigado mais uma vez por nos acolher neste belíssimo espaço. Senhores Presidentes Senhores Reitores, Senhores Presidentes dos Institutos Politécnicos, Senhores Diretores-Gerais, caros deputados aqui presentes, caros professores, investigadores, técnicos. A discussão sobre o financiamento do ensino superior é uma discussão que se impõe sempre com grande centralidade nos debates do ensino superior. Eu costumo dizer, num tom às vezes um pouco mais provocatório, que é difícil ter uma reunião com responsáveis institucionais e não falar de financiamento, ou pelo menos que o tema não domine a reunião, porque de facto os recursos que são colocados e que são dispostos para o sistema e para as instituições é de facto um tema absolutamente central para o funcionamento do sistema de ensino superior e para a prossecução das suas missões. Aliás, há alguns anos houve um investigador americano que fez uma pesquisa de quantas vezes era usado o termo crise no ensino superior e em quase 2/3 o termo crise era sempre associado a crise financeira ou crise do financiamento. E, portanto, não é uma especificidade portuguesa, em todos os sistemas há sempre uma preocupação muito central na questão do financiamento. E o tema que hoje nos traz e o tema central do relatório é, de facto, muito importante para o funcionamento, no que diz respeito ao volume de recursos que é disponibilizado para o sistema, mas também, igualmente importante, a forma como nós os utilizamos, a forma como nós os distribuímos e também a forma como nós os complementamos com outras fontes de financiamento, sejam elas públicas ou privadas. E, portanto, as questões são questões absolutamente estruturantes em termos do sistema. Mas os modelos de financiamento não existem no vazio. Esses modelos de financiamento têm um efeito que molda o sistema, porque os modelos de financiamento ou os sistemas de financiamento não têm apenas um impacto no curto prazo, mas têm um impacto estruturante no funcionamento dos sistemas de ensino superior. Para usar uma terminologia que a minha disciplina de formação costumava usar ao efeito estático e ao efeito dinâmico. O efeito estático no imediato, na forma como, por exemplo, quais são os critérios que nós usamos para alocar os recursos, privilegiando esta ou aquela missão, privilegiando um perfil de instituições, privilegiando objetivos de eficiência ou de equidade, ou de coesão territorial, ou de ligação ao meio. Mas, porventura, o efeito mais importante que os sistemas de financiamento do ensino superior têm é porque induzem comportamentos, porque sinalizam aquilo que é prioritário para o sistema e para as instituições de ensino superior que fazem esse sistema. E por isso é muito importante olhar para os modelos de financiamento, ligando esses modelos de financiamento para aquilo que são os objetivos mais amplos, mais transversais da política pública. Nós nunca podemos ter uma discussão sobre o modelo de financiamento sem pensar de que forma é que esse modelo de financiamento é congruente com a rede de ensino superior que queremos ter e que temos, com o perfil das instituições de ensino superior e as suas missões que temos e gostaríamos de ter, ou quais aspectos queremos valorizar, no fundo, quais são os objetivos da política pública para o ensino superior, porque o modelo de financiamento é a concretização desses objetivos, desses estímulos, dessas preocupações. E por isso o debate que nós teremos a partir da apresentação do relatório, e que, aliás, parece-nos que o próprio relatório já reflete, é um debate que vai muito mais além do que meramente a questão do financiamento do ensino superior. E, portanto, é um debate absolutamente estruturante e por isso é muito importante este compromisso que a Sra. Ministra da Ciência, Tecnologia e Ensino Superior assumiu desde a primeira ida ao Parlamento, de que esta seria uma prioridade para esta legislatura, porque tem, de facto, um efeito estruturante. Mas ele deve também ser pensado à luz de outros debates que estão a ocorrer e que emergirão necessariamente em 2023, que são também eles muito estruturantes, sobre a rede de ensino superior, sobre a diversidade das instituições e o tipo de diversidade que nós queremos no sistema, sobre o RGES, enfim, sobre um conjunto de documentos que são absolutamente fundadores e enquadradores do sistema. E é por isso também que o debate deve ser um debate participado e alargado. Parafraseando a famosa frase, eu diria que o financiamento é demasiado importante para ser deixado aos economistas, porque é uma questão que tem necessariamente, reflete necessariamente escolhas e implicações políticas, mas eu penso que também seria necessário ou seria desejável, se me permitem terminar com esta provocação, que o financiamento do ensino superior é demasiado importante para ser deixado apenas ao ensino superior. Não deve ser apenas um debate, deve ser certamente um debate que envolve os parceiros no ensino superior, mas deve ser um debate que seja um debate amplo e que envolva toda a sociedade, porque no fundo é um debate sobre o ensino superior que temos e o ensino superior que queremos. E, portanto, é importante, obviamente, o contributo que as instituições de ensino superior, que os estudantes, que os professores, que as unidades de investigação possam ter e possam contribuir para este debate, mas era muito importante que nós conseguíssemos mobilizar para além disso e que a sociedade portuguesa sentisse este debate como um debate absolutamente instrumental para, não apenas para o desenvolvimento e fortalecimento do ensino superior, mas, que é aquilo que nos move, para o desenvolvimento e fortalecimento do país em termos económicos, em termos de equidade e em termos sociais. E, portanto, eu penso que este é um momento muito importante, quer pelo debate sobre o sistema de financiamento do ensino superior em Portugal, mas quer por aquilo que isso significa, ou que pode significar para o sistema de ensino superior em Portugal, e por isso, oxalá, saibamos aproveitar esta oportunidade. Muito obrigado.
Vamos dar início à apresentação do estudo Resourcing Higher Education in Portugal. Chamo Ana Moreno Monroy, gestora de programas na OCDE para as questões da demografia e desigualdades regionais, e Simon Roy, coordenador na OCDE para as políticas públicas de ensino superior, a quem passo a palavra.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to share some key findings from the report that we've been undertaking over the last 18 months a report that we've prepared with taking into account many inputs, including many conversations that we held with many of those present today about, to gain perspectives about the financing of higher education in Portugal and the strategic development of higher education in Portugal. What I will talk about today is essentially very briefly just tell you a little bit of context for the work that we've undertaken, and then essentially talk in two blocks about, firstly, what one might call a diagnosis, to some extent, an assessment of the current situation as we see it in relation to resourcing higher education. We can talk about within that, and I will talk about in many ways, the many positive developments that we see in the higher education system in Portugal in international comparison. Before then talking, and this will be a focus of Anna's analysis, looking at the evolution of the environment in which higher education is developing in Portugal, in particular the demography of this country and how that will impact on higher education going forward. Before then looking at the actual current resourcing policy environment, that's to say the policies which are in place at the moment that deliver funding to higher education institutions and deliver funding to students. So we will look at the policy there before concluding with a review of the recommendations that have come out of our analysis that are based on the analysis that we've done. The report has been published, it's been made available now, and that has more detail in terms of the recommendations, so I will focus on the main points there. One thing I think I should say really at the upfront is that, as with many OECD reviews, our job is to come and to provide an external perspective on a system in consultation with you and with consultation with people deeply involved in the system, to provide that external assessment and to come up with suggestions and potential pointers. Our job is not to prescribe what exactly you should do next. And I think it's very important to make that point. In many cases, what we are recommending, also looking at some of the press reports this morning, some of the things that we're recommending are essentially helpful, we see as helpful pointers, but in many cases they then require further analysis and thinking as a community, as a higher education community within Portugal, on how those could be taken forward. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind when viewing the role of the OECD in this kind of exercise. Just very quickly, if we think about higher education resourcing, this review has been part of a broader project that we've been undertaking in the OECD, which is examining the way higher education systems are funded and some of the other policies that affect the way resources are used within higher education systems and institutions, which include policies that affect the way academic staff are employed. They include policies around student support and financial and non-financial support to students, but equally they involve policies which affect the way higher education institutions operate, which are not to do with actual funding, which maybe do regulatory factors, things like the regulation of program offers and of program places, but equally very fundamental decisions, historically certainly, about the creation or the merger of institutions and so on. So the landscape of higher education is also affected by public policy over time. So we've tried to take a broad approach in considering resourcing higher education and to therefore, within the review, look at various elements. One of them is really what we've called core funding for the higher education institutions. That's to say the money that's required on a day-to-day basis to operate a higher education institution and how that is allocated. That's a kind of a basic day-to-day function of government in systems which have public funding for higher education institutions. But they've also taken into account a broader perspective and what was talked about earlier in terms of the dynamic and the future-oriented perspective for higher education. How do you also potentially use resources to help support the future and strategic development of the system? So that's not the day-to-day business of running and paying the bills now and the salaries now, but also investing in the future, investing in strategic development. And we've tried to consider that, and we'll consider that in a second block of discussion. And finally, the question of funding students. And we've considered within the report quite a bit about the way public policy makes higher education accessible and the different tools which are used by public policy to make higher education accessible, and we'll come to that. Going then to our assessment of the current situation, starting with, I think, some things which is very important to stress when we talk about higher education in Portugal, and that is some of the major successes the system has had in the last decade. In many ways, for example, the system is one which has, in recent years, again, started to grow. It's a system where first-time enrollment has increased, and where you've seen in recent years the development and expansion of a short cycle offer, the TESP. That is a significant development, and has created many new opportunities for individuals to take part in higher education. The graduate numbers equally increasing in recent years. So in a system which is taking in more students, a system which is producing more graduates. Completion is another measure that we often look at in international assessments of higher education system. Here, this is from the most recent Education at a Glance. Portugal essentially in the middle picture, but this shows a completion within a nominal, the theoretical duration of programs, and then after 3 years. And after 3 years, Portugal achieves very reasonable attainment and completion rates in its system. There are some disparities, particularly between men and women, which are displayed in this year's Education at a Glance, and that's something I think that it's a sort of as an aside in a way that comes out as something that is worth looking at in going forward. It's a system which has a strong base in the natural sciences and engineering. That's a well-known strength of the Portuguese system, a historical one. But in terms of the numbers of graduates that are being produced per head of population in the field of science and engineering, Portugal is significantly above the average of OECD countries. The reason it has an overall production of graduates that's slightly below the OECD average is in fact because of lower numbers in the social sciences and humanities, and there is also a lower number in ICT. But the essential point is that there is this strong supply of technical skills, and that's something that's noteworthy in international comparison. What we also see, and what's very important to stress, is the attainment rate in Portugal. This uses the measure that we typically use, which is the age cohort 25 to 34. That here, Portugal is the European Union country that has increased its attainment rate by the most in the last decade. So it's gone from 29% in 2012 to almost 47.5%, but edging towards 50% attainment rate. Those holding a higher education qualification in that age group in 2021. So this is a really impressive achievement, which is important to stress. Equally, if we take a regional perspective, the attainment rate has increased across all regions, and there's an increasing convergence in attainment across the territory of Portugal. And that's something that we also, in a sense, is a success story in a world where actually regional disparities are often increasing in many OECD countries. And here we actually have a real clear case of convergence in attainment rates across the territory. Equally, employment outcomes. Overall, what we see in Portugal is that employment outcomes of tertiary graduates are good. They're good in international comparison, and the earnings advantage, which is a crude but nevertheless relevant measure of the demand for tertiary graduates, the earnings advantage for tertiary graduates over those with only upper secondary education is actually rather significant. So it's among the highest, in fact, along with of countries like the US and Ireland. So it's in that top area, top range in the OECD comparison. So what we would typically say is that, yeah, indeed, that shows that there is still skills demand, which is demand for tertiary graduates, and that's something that we also see from the economic prognosis for the country and the skills demand projections that we see in general. So in general, we have this broadly, I would say, positive story about a system that has developed, but what we have to take into account when assessing and when we're thinking about the future of resourcing the system is how the environment in which higher education operates is evolving, and particularly given for it's a system that serves people, how the population is going to evolve. And that's something that Anna will now discuss in brief in the next section of the presentation.
Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Simon was saying, on this next bit of the presentation, we'll focus on the changing environment of higher education provision in Portugal, specifically in relation to demographic change. So demographic change, meaning the slowing of population growth and aging population, is something that all OECD's countries are struggling with right now. But in this context, we know that Portuguese regions, especially interior regions, are some of the most affected. And you must be familiar with the preliminary information from the 2021 census that shows this striking picture of demographic change in Portugal. So it's a striking contrast between shrinking regions in the interior, those in green, and growth in the coastal regions, those in blue. So something that we note here is that there is, in a context of overall shrinking of the national population, so barely any growth, 0.17% annually in the last decade, there is a very concentrated growth pattern. So only 21% of the parishes showed positive population growth in the last decade. In the meantime, all the other places that you see in green show shrinking sometimes at very fast rates, so up to 6% annually in the last decade. That's a very fast rate of growth. At the same time, we also know that the population is aging, and often the population is aging precisely in those places that are experiencing population decline. So many of these interior regions face both population decline and aging at the same time. And this is going to be very important, of course, for the provision of higher education, because population growth drives demand. So if you have your absolute population numbers declining, and especially like we observe in Portugal, if the people that are most likely to attend higher education, which in the case is Portugal is those between the ages of 20 and 29, are going to expect a reduction in the next decade. That means that the demand for higher education coming from a traditional source of population growth will decline. And we observe this shrinking of that age range across all regions, but we also see a pattern where some regions will experience a higher decrease, so all regions except for the metropolitan area of Lisbon. So we see there in the picture, if you look at the total bars, that means the expected population change from here to 2035. Then you see that the only regions that is absolutely expected to grow in population is the metropolitan area of Lisbon. And all the other regions, most of them, will see a decline in population, including the largest region that it is now, North. Within that context, this traditional group will shrink. As you see in the light blue bars, you will see by comparing the bars in each region, there is a reduction. So that means the absolute number of people that could be potentially enter higher education in this age range will certainly decline in the next decade according to the population projections that are available to us. In this context, then you have this contrasting view between those regions experiencing shrinking and the Lisbon metropolitan area that is the only region that will then face an increase, although not by a large margin. So how does it look like now? Of course, if you have decreasing demand, then you wonder, will this create a gap between supply and demand? Because obviously, the capacity that is installed today in the system is meant for a population that was larger in the past. And we see that as you progress further and the population declines, especially in this traditional student age range, there will be an increasing mismatch between the supply or offer of study places and the demand for those places. So one proxy that we can use to measure this gap initially is the occupancy rate, at least for the demand for initial education of traditional students. And we already see two big differences there. The first one is a difference across regions. So you have some regions where this occupancy rate is over 100%. That means larger demand than supply. And we see other regions where it is below 100%. That means that not all places that are initially offered are filled in with students applying for first-time entry. The other big difference that we see is in the type of education. So we see this gap between supply and demand is larger in the public polytechnics. Those columns that are highlighted there, you can see for yourself. So given this context of a possible mismatch of supply and demand and the projections that we have in population of this problem maybe worsening into the future, what can be done is the question. So we have suggesting here two main options, just to steer some thoughts. The first one is attracting new student populations or into higher education, or diversifying the type of students that enter higher education. So see, here we analyze some pockets of untapped demand. This is what we call. So I'll try to explain this graph in sequence, but this part of the presentation focuses on the students that come from the scientific humanistic track that make more than 80% of the demands of higher education. So if we focus in that part of the population, that is the bulk of students graduating in Portugal, and then we try to relate their probability of entering into higher education with the physical access they have to a higher education institution. So of course, living next to a university doesn't mean you will attend that university, but we know that not having physical access can affect the chances of entering into higher education. So we wanted to examine the relationship between these two things. And this is the picture that we got. So you have a wide difference in accessibility to study places, measured here as driving 45 minutes. So the number of study places that you can reach by driving 45 minutes. These are differences across the country. And of course, the most urbanized areas, the largest functional urban areas, have the higher accessibility because they concentrate most of the establishments. And you have places in the country that have relatively low accessibility, meaning the students traveling for 45 minutes there can access a lower proportion of study places. But a very interesting thing that this graph shows is that the relationship is not necessarily one-to-one. So you see on the left-hand side, so places that have low accessibility do not necessarily have low entry rates. So you see many places, even though the access is not very high, they have the majority of students graduating from a scientific humanistic track entering higher education. There is a big spread at that level. So there you also have places where you could make more of a relationship between low access and low entry. On the other hand, if you focus at the other extreme of the graph, and this is something very important that came out from the analysis, is that not necessarily having high access means that entry rates will be higher. So there are other reasons explaining the lack of entry of many students that live in functional urban areas, specifically around Lisbon, that are not related to the physical access to a university. So there we relate this more perhaps to socioeconomic background reasons. So a lot of a big, let's say, market is on top there because there is a lot of students that have the physical access but are not entering, and this is something that should be further examined. Now, if we focus now from the scientific track into the vocational track, and this is the highest source of segregation in the system, because we see very big differences in the probability of entry of students that graduate from the scientific humanistic track compared to the ones that graduate from the vocational track. So specifically, only 24% of those that graduate from the vocational track enter higher education within 1 year, compared to 81% from the scientific humanistic track. So already, as you know, following that track leads to lower probability. But in this context of segregation between these two types of entry, we see large variations, again, across places. So we see that, for instance, in Portugal, in Porto and Lisboa, you have 79%, around 78% students that graduate from these tracks that are not enrolled in higher education. And we relate this mostly to maybe on-tap potential of the TESPs, the short cycle programs. Because as you see in Porto and Lisboa, you have only 10% of students that follow these tracks, whereas we know it's possible to increase that percentage if you focus, for instance, in places like Bragança and Leira, where these rates are 21%. So there could be, let's say, an argument to increase the provision of this type of programs in Porto and Lisbon, specifically because if you count the absolute number of students that could potentially follow those tracks but are not following them, there is a big demand to be realized there. And finally, now if we focus on the non-traditional students, so those that are not necessarily in the age of 20, 29, but are older students, that is a different market that is very important for Portugal. So you have to diversify demand. We already saw what happens with the students that come from a traditional age. But now, how does it look for students, for instance, in the bracket 30, 39 years old? So we know around only 4% are enrolled in education and training, and this is relatively low for international standards. The majority of them are enrolled in traditional tertiary programs. And see, here we see big potential, for instance, for more flexible programs, for instance, short cycle programs. You see, or you almost cannot see because it's so small, the proportion of these students in the age 30, 39 that attend short cycle tertiary education is extremely low in Portugal. So this is something that could be expanded, especially because this differentiation by age ranges is going to be very important for Portugal moving forward to increase the demand for education. Now, that was the first option. Now, let's talk about a second option, which is redirecting student demand. So, first of all, if we will evaluate by international standards, is the provision of higher education in Portugal accessible or not in physical terms? So, can most people access a higher education institution within a reasonable time? And how does this fare in the international arena, meaning compared to OECD countries? We do this type of analysis by checking the distance of people that travel to a university, in this case within a 30-minute radius, and compare it across countries. So for Portugal, as you can see, is pretty much on the right. The levels of accessibility, of physical accessibility, are relatively high for international standards. They are also higher from what you can expect based only on urbanization rates, if we measure that as the proportion of people that live in functional urban areas. So if this access match urbanization, you would see Portugal along the 45-degree line, but Portugal is actually on this side, meaning that it has more access than what is expected solely by its rates of urbanization. And you can compare Portugal with for instance, a country like Poland that has similar urbanization rates, but much lower access. So for Portugal, it's over 80% of people that can access a higher education institution, whereas for Poland, it's only about 55%. So physical accessibility seems to be high for international standards. Okay. So now, of course, having an institution next to you, as I was saying before, does not guarantee that you will attend an institution or that you will attend that institution. We know that there is a lot of geographical mobility of students, that these decisions are driven by program choice, by proximity to future jobs, etc. So there is a correlation, but it's not a perfect correlation. We try to understand how much and where students move across Portugal, because this migration of students will be a very important component in a country that is experiencing such an unbalanced demographic change as we saw before. So the map presents you with the net student flows in the last decades. The areas in blue represent positive student flows, and the areas in green represent negative student flows. And you can already recognize some of the places that have some of the largest higher education institutions in the country. Of course, those places attract more students than they send out. And across the country, this provision of higher education is concentrated across 62 municipalities. So when students choose to move, they choose across a much narrower set of municipalities than the country as a whole already, 62 of them. But when they choose, most of them move in a very close vicinity, so less than 50 kilometers from where they live. And this is a lot explained by, let's say, the gravitational pull of the functional urban areas. So you see the areas in darker green, those represent the largest outflows on the net. And those are areas that are around the the centers of the functional urban areas. So these urban areas attract like a magnet, but they attract mostly people from around the area. So if you see it from a functional point of view, those places are serving first and foremost their most proximate markets. So you see all the areas forming around the largest cities in Portugal. And this is very important because when you look at a place like Évora in the interior, Évora does not have this market at its disposal necessarily, because in itself is not a very large place. And if you look at the places around it, there is not a lot of population. So Évora has to make more of an effort to diversify the flow of students, because students will have to come from areas that are further away from Évora compared to Lisbon and Porto, for instance. So that is the challenge of places that are not already surrounded by a big market of potential students, that they have to be attractive for longer distances and that they can draw from a much smaller pool of local students than places that are already located around the centers of attraction of the functional urban areas. So if we look, for instance, the combined flows of these three functional urban areas, they make up for half of the flows of the country. And this already tells you something about the magnitude of this. Now, if we look at this graph, tries to tell a story about how diverse places are in terms of the origins of the students and how much they are attractive to local students. So at the very extreme, you see Lisbon. That is a place that has both high local attractiveness, because 3 out of 4 students that graduate from high schools in Lisbon attend a university in the functional urban area of Lisbon. And that has low diversity relatively, because 3 out of students that you find in establishments in Lisbon come from the Lisbon metropolitan area and surrounding functional urban area. If you compare this, for instance, to a place like Coimbra, it's a place that is more diverse because it still manages to attract 3 out of 4 students that graduate from high schools in Coimbra, but it also attracts 60% of students from other parts of the country. So this is different, maybe contrasting with a place like Évora, where only 50% of the students that graduate from schools in Évora attend universities in Évora. That means that Évora has 80% of students that come from other places. So this is a very important thing to take into account, that functional urban areas are serving first and foremost the areas around themselves, and that the other places that do not have such markets must rely on a more diverse kind of demand, meaning coming from other parts of the country. And now finally, before we move into the implications for policy, how do these things relate to employment opportunities? Because it can be a big driver of moving, for instance, to functional urban areas to study. So we see, if we think students make their decisions on study programs and study location based on the probable employment outcomes that they will have, you will see this pattern that most of them will flock into the functional urban areas, and specifically the functional urban area of Lisbon, because it has lower chances of unemployment after graduation, as you can see on the right of the graph. But also interestingly, coming from a place that does not have such a high access does not necessarily mean that you will experience higher unemployment. And we see again this large variation across the places that have low accessibility, across the smaller places. So there you could either have very low chances of employment, even lower chances than if you studied in Lisbon in some places, whereas they can be very high, 3 times the order of magnitude, if you come from another place. So this is what we call inequality in opportunity in a way, because depending on where you study, your chances of unemployment are higher or lower. So reducing the spread of these outcomes is a very important policy target. And with my colleague Simon will elaborate more on how to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So we dwelled a lot on these context and population flows simply because they're so important and will be so important for the future development of higher education in the system and within the country. If we just summarize very rapidly before turning also to more of the policy issues that we've looked at, basically what we're saying is that capacity for traditional students, between inverted commas, is already exceeds demand in some places, that as a result, what we see a need for diversification of the students coming into the system, and Anna has talked about various sources of that in terms of vocational graduates, vocational track graduates and adults. We see that only a minority of students are really able and willing to move far for higher education. So that issue of mobility is important. So we say that it's important within policy to adopt a rational approach and a reasonable approach in terms of thinking about domestic student mobility and where students are likely to move from. And also that employment question and the links to the labour market is very important in making the considerations about where you expect and want students to move within the country. And finally, that there are actually large underserved populations in the functional urban areas, in the big urban areas of the country, and that actually means that there's a need to expand provision. Also taking into account the mobility point, there is a need probably to expand provision in certain types of provision, in certain types of program, in particularly the Lisbon metropolitan area. If we think about specifically the higher education institutions located in what we might call regional locations, so outside those big urban areas, then what we have considered is really that if we look also at international practice, that there are 3 main key missions that those sorts of institutions can play. There's an issue about providing post-secondary education that is relevant to local populations and those populations who are least likely to travel and to access higher education or post-secondary education elsewhere. We think particularly about working adults and those with, so we say, least likely historically to have entered higher education. That's what's one target audience. You also have a clear link between regional economies and public services and local and regional higher education providers. That's to say, providing skills to flow to regional businesses and regional public services. That is also a very key and important type of activity for these kinds of institutions. And the third one is to do with centres of excellence. And we've noticed this in the discussions we've had with many institutions, particularly in interior regions, is that there is also the potential to build on real strengths related to, say, research excellence in a particular area, or linked to, relatedly, but linked to connections with local industries or local specialities specializations within the industrial base, that there as well there is a potential to build particular program offerings, which then may also attract students to a greater extent from outside the regions. And that is the sort of, that last element is very important in considering the future development of the system, is that people, if you wish to get people to move region and attract people to other regions, then having that offer that's based on a solid base of excellence is very important. The policy context we examined, we have examined it in three sections. The policies, as I've already said, to fund higher education institutions on a day-to-day basis, the policies which are there to help support the strategic development of the system, and the policies which are there to help and promote access for students. If we look at the overall funding of higher education in Portugal, one thing we would just say is that the broad pattern of public and private, that's in principle actually mostly a question of public money on one side and tuition fees on another, that share is broadly in line with the OECD average. It's very equivalent, for example, to what you have in the Netherlands, which is a system which has moderate fees by European standards, but then has public funding in it. So that proportion is entirely within the OECD average. You do have this flow of European money going into higher education in Portugal, which is a particular feature within the share of funding in higher education in Portugal in international comparison. If we talk about the level of funding, so the level of funding per full-time equivalent student, which is the core measure that we typically use. Here, what this graph shows is the level of funding per full-time equivalent students in higher education in Portugal. So that's all sectors of public and of the public system. It excludes the private sector. It's only the public system. It's looking at it by spending per function, where you take off basically research, which is in grey, and you have something which we call internationally ancillary services, but that's basically like student services. So you take out that, and what you're left with is called core funding, and that's the dark blue in this. So what we see there is that Portugal is somewhat lower than the OECD average, but it's within a band. It's rather similar to Spain, for example, and some other countries, but higher than a country like Italy. This is adjusted using purchasing power parity. It's the standard measure we use in the OECD. At the far end, you see the two Anglo-Saxon countries, the UK and the United States, which have this very high level of spending, which is driven, as you will be aware, even in the public sectors, by very high tuition fees in particular. That's the context we're talking about. If we look at the funding for the day-to-day operations, our main finding and our main message from our assessment and discussion of the policy context is that the non-application of the formula, which has not been applied since 2009, has created inequities within the system. What we essentially see is a divergence of the funding that public institutions receive per what we've called weighted student. That's a funding unit. So as you're probably familiar with, within the formula, you have funding per student, but then it is weighted by field of study. So you have essentially you have within the university sector medicine, which is funded at 4, and then you have at the other end subjects which are funded at 1. So this takes into account that difference in funding per subject area and looks specifically at the funding per weighted student. And what we see is considerable divergence. Although there was divergence in 2009, which is when the last time the formula was applied, that has increased with time as the funding system has been operated on the basis of historical allocations rather than being aligned to the real level of student activity. And that's a clear and direct result of of the non-application of a formula, for which there were, of course, many reasons. If we look at what that means in an individual institutional basis, in the university sector, what we see essentially is those institutions which have grown most in student numbers have seen the greatest decline in funding per student or per student unit, so weighted student. Equally, those that have seen a decline in funding have actually seen their funding increase. This is in nominal euros, so we must take that into account. But we're looking at nominal euros. We're not adjusting for inflation here. So, but the pattern is obviously the same. It's just to say that those that have grown don't immediately think they've got an enormous amount more money. It's in real terms, but nevertheless, this is the pattern, and this is the direct result of the non-application of a funding formula. If we look at the polytechnic sector, you have a situation where the vast majority, so the enrollment change in the index is in the red. You have the vast majority of institutions that have actually seen a decline in enrollment since 2009. And there you see that all institutions have increased marginally, but those that have seen the greatest decline in student numbers have seen the highest increase in funding per weighted student. If we talk, then this is a question we discussed at length. And what if we think about, well, does this matter? Our view is that yes, because there is a direct relationship between the numbers of students that are in an institution and the level of activity and that's taking place, and the ability of institutions to take care of their students appropriately, in particular in relation to staff-student ratios, so class sizes that you're going to be able to guarantee within institutions, and that has an impact on the quality of the education that you can provide. If we look internationally, there is a debate between OECD countries about the use of formulas. But we do see that many advanced systems within the OECD do use funding formulas to try and guarantee an equitable and transparent allocation of funding between public institutions. And it's our view that that is an appropriate way of allocating funding, particularly in a system which is dynamic. But we'll come to some of the provisos, some of the sort of qualifications to that statement in general. But as a general principle, we consider that funding through the formula is an appropriate way of allocating core funding within a higher education system. You can look at this in great detail. I'm conscious that we have limited time at the moment. The second area, so that we'll come back to what we're saying to remedy that in the next section of the presentation. But if we move on to the second area of analysis, which was how does the system, and it's very important to decouple this from the day-to-day operation, how does the system fund and support the strategic development of the system? Here we see the scope for further change within the system. What we do acknowledge within the report at length is that there has been a clear shift within the Portuguese higher education system towards one that has a clearer strategy, has clearer establishment of goals, that through the Contrato de Legislatura you had a clear national level framework for the higher education system, and that in its most recent iteration that has included clear goals, measurable targets, and so on. But it's actually quite a broad brush approach. So we clearly see the value of it in terms of creating dialogue between the higher education sector and government as the main funder, and as providing a steering framework for the system. But what we argue in the report is that there is actually a need, given the variation and the diversity that exists in the institutional landscape in Portugal, there's a need to translate this kind of approach of agreement between government and institutions to the institutional level, to allow differentiation in goals between institutions. And for that, we suggest we will go on to this, but we note that many advanced higher education systems, and this is a discussion that's already been held in Portugal, I am aware, but that many systems are using various forms of institutional agreement. Historically, sometimes they've been called performance agreements. It's not necessary to necessarily stress the word performance. Many of these systems, none of these agreement systems, in fact, in reality, are much more a framework for discussion between institutions and the government, and also a means to establish a profile and establish a strategy at institutional level. So it's less about monitoring, have you performed X on a particular indicator, but more a framework for setting out goals and discussing those goals with the funding authority. There's obviously more information about different models in the report. What we do say in the report, and it's quite important, is within this idea where for strategic development it's very important that each institution establishes a profile and establishes its own strategy and its own goals which are appropriate to its context. We do say that it's important that that's based on a realistic assessment of facts. And what we will say within, and as we've already highlighted, the diversity of institutional profiles that exist, but this is just one example of diversity that exists within the university sector, which is to say the intensity of doctoral training within the sector. So you have your institutions within the system, which are normally public universities, but in terms of the output of doctoral training, that varies, as we all know, very considerably between institutions, and that would obviously be one sort of factor why an institutional approach, the strategy for doctoral training in university in the university in the north of Lisbon versus in one of the institutions which has a far lower doctoral density is obviously very different, and that is the key point here. We need to take into account the realities that exist in different institutions. Finally, on terms of the sort of diagnosis element of the existing policies, in the area of access and student support, what we note is there's a well-established grant system within the higher education system in Portugal. It fits broadly within a model that exists in many OECD, or European OECD countries in particular, which is one which is to say the grant system covers a relatively small proportion of the student population. So it's not a universal grant system. It's actually around 25% of the student of the undergraduate population is in receipt of a grant. But that puts it broadly in line with quite a number of other countries like Belgium, in France, Germany. So it's in that model, and the level of grants in terms of the level of support that is provided to individual students is, we could probably say, modest in comparison to certain systems within the OECD. At the other extreme, you have Nordic systems and English-speaking systems, which tend to have almost universal access to some forms of student support, but variation in terms of the level of that support. And obviously in systems like the United States, in Australia, in England, less so in the United States, but in England and Australia, and to some extent in the United States, you also have a high reliance on loans. So that is repayable support, but it's support nevertheless. So that's to say that Portugal fits within that space. That's an entirely legitimate choice. It's completely consistent with what's happening in many other advanced systems, but it's just to be aware of that reality in considering student support, and considering, of course, is there scope to increase the proportion of students? If we talk about the other side, which is the tuition fees, which has been the subject of policy change in this country in recent years, what we note is the reduction in the student fees for bachelor students that has been applied in over 2 financial years. What we highlight there is essentially that what's happened is an untargeted reduction, that it's applied for everyone, and it's not being targeted to those students most in need. Our view is, within a restricted financial context where there is essentially a scarcity of resources, this kind of investment should be targeted carefully, and that in this case what's happened essentially is that those who are essentially from wealthier backgrounds who are able to pay have received a reduction which could have been, and which has been compensated by government, that could have been better spent and better targeted to achieve social objectives in terms of participation in higher education. So that is actually the main point we say. We make a suggestion about potentially having a more graduated system of fees, which we'll come to in a second, but that this is to say that that was the basis for our analysis. Finally, we looked at, in the detailed analysis of the data, we looked at the amount of money spent by institutions on their student support services, and we noted within that considerable variation in the per student spend on student support services, on social action services. And obviously there is considerable variation in the need in different institutions. The level of, for example, the proportion of grant recipients in different institutions varies very considerably. However, we don't see a strong correlation between the number of, or proportion of grant recipients and the level of spend on student action services. So what we say here is that we will come to this in a second, is that there's a need to look at that and explain why is there that variation. This, by the way, only covers institutions which don't have foundational status, because the data isn't reported in the same way for those with foundation status. I'm going to pass then relatively quickly through what we are recommending. We recommend and make recommendations in those three areas, in the areas of, firstly, core operating funding to institutions, and we'll come to the strategic funding in a second. Here, what we say essentially, and I will go very rapidly here, is essentially, on one hand, we think there's a need for greater clarity about what the core funds paid for by the state budget are for. So a declaration of purpose which is clearer than it is at the moment. We feel that in particular there is some lack of clarity about whether or not this funding is paying for a certain element of core research activity and doctoral training in universities, because there is a separate funding, of course, through the FCT for research, but nevertheless the complementarity between those two funding streams, the FCT funding and the core funding, needs to be clearer in legislation and in regulation, and that's something to take forward. There's also the question about, in future, but only after the current funding period, how TESH short cycle programs are funded and whether they go through the core funding model. And that integration is a question that's for the future, because the current funding model is essentially in place with European funds until 2027. But there is a need to consider that very carefully. The second main recommendation is to have a new formula, but to develop a new formula, not simply to take the formula from 2006, to work out why the different elements are included, but to keep it quite simple. We have no evidence internationally that complicated formulas work. It's very important to use simple student-based activity indicators. Frankly, there's very limited evidence that output indicators have a particular effect. They can send a signal, but they don't radically, for example, increase graduation rates if you fund graduates rather than students. So we don't think it's important to get to that's not the crucial question. The question is actually about having a fair, transparent, and equitable system of core funding for institutions. What we do say, and what we recognize very clearly, is if you have something that's very related simply to student numbers, this can lead to undesirable variation year on year as student numbers fall. So we do very clearly say you should have mechanisms within the system that protect institutions against that kind of variation. And there are two mechanisms we say. One is that you can consider a fixed component within the funding. So that's to say you don't link 100% of the core funding to a formula. You set a certain proportion at the beginning of the system, and you maintain that and just increase it in line with inflation over time. So you maintain a fixed proportion within the system. There is a model in Denmark that is an interesting one to look at in that respect and how they've done that, because they specifically reintroduced that after having almost 100% purely student-related system. The second thing we say is to use averages, for example, over 2 years as the baseline rather than simply the previous year. So using an averaging factor to reduce the fluctuation that's linked. So we do say then, as I say, that we've put a number of questions to Portugal about which parameters you might want to use. But the fundamental thing is to keep it simple and to not worry too much about trying to incorporate performance into it, because that doesn't, as far as international experience shows, work particularly effectively. The final point, and it's a very important one, is to say two things. One, a new system will require a transition period, because there will be winners and losers ultimately from a system that regularizes and realigns funding and student activity. So if that is the case, you're going to need a transition period, and that's a clear recommendation. The design of that transition period we leave clearly to the experts in Portugal, how that might best be designed. We do provide some suggestions of things to consider. And the other issue is essentially money. Ideally, you would need more money to do some of this. We recognize this is a very tight fiscal situation. It's unrealistic for the OECD to come in and say, you should just spend more money on this. But there is a good case to be made, we would argue, is if you're putting the funding system on a new rational model with a clear links, as we will come to in the next recommendations, to improving the profile and efficiency and outputs of the system, that there is a clear case to be made, now we should invest in this system. But we do recognize that that's a challenging ask. But additional money is always important, is always useful when you're trying to make this kind of reform. The second area of recommendation then is on the future development of the system, about which we've talked at rather great length. We recommend that there is a need to set in place, and given that the current contract for the legislative term comes to an end next year, that it's the moment to think about a new vision for the system. We think that must explicitly take into account the demographic context that Anna presented, and the need, the reality, the inevitability that there will need to be change in the system, and that the current configuration of institutions and institutional profiles cannot continue simply as it is. There's a need for a very clear and honest conversation about the future of the system, and that can be done through a national strategy. We argue very strongly for profiling at institutional level, which is to say that institutions should have a clear conversation about what they're doing well, what they can do well, where they can develop, and that has also got to take place with a realistic assessment of where student demand is going to come from, taking into account the factors that Anna presented. We suggest that this system of probably 4-year institutional agreements is a good way forward in that respect. It is good that that we ask institutions to develop strategies and profiles, and those are set down. They can be quite concise, but that they are set down in institutional agreements, and that there are a certain number, a limited number of targets within that, which are then can be expressed in a more qualitative terms. They don't all have to be quantitative targets, but that they can then be assessed and agreed between government and institutions. That there would then be, the third recommendation here, some funding that is related to this, that is funded through multi-annual allocations explicitly for the strategic development of institutions. The important point here is that we see an uncoupling of the money for day-to-day operations from some specific money that is allocated for strategic development. What we say is also that all institutions should receive funding for strategic development, but there are some institutions which in their strategic plans will highlight a greater need for restructuring, a greater need for reorientation, and that there should be a specific funding stream for that. So in addition, so that they would get additional funds specifically to address the adjustment, what we've called adjustment funding. And that is about facing up to the realities of the changing and operating environment and responding to that in a rational manner. We also make within the report a number of suggestions about how other tools might be considered within this. These are in particular the numerus clausus system. We make recommendations saying that in certain very specific cases there may be opportunities to use the numerus clausus system to support the development of centers of excellence in certain institutions, that there may be a strategic use of the numerus clausus system in that respect, but that it's very important to assess the impact of that. We make, within the context of a system where we're recommending greater institutional profiling, we suggest that it would be ideally possible to have more what we've called, and I recognize the word flexible is controversial sometimes, but a more flexible workload model for academic staff, which is to say that academic staff could have different profiles. Not all academic staff are the same. We recognize the challenges within many systems. This is also a challenge in other systems. But it's also the direction we see of the academic workforce, that there are different profiles probably needed within different institutions, and that greater flexibility may be needed. So having a fixed teaching load and teaching requirements nationally is not necessarily the best approach in a modern higher education system. Finally, we talk a little bit about the complementarity of what A3ES does in terms of its evaluation, taking into account institutional profile, and FCT in terms of the research funding to support institutional profiling. Finally, and relatively quickly, on the issue of accessible higher education. What we talk about here is, on one hand, the historically important commitment to territorial coverage of higher education in the country. We say that that is important for the reasons I've already discussed earlier about the role of regional institutions, but that here we don't think that it's important to uncouple the idea of regional coverage from the existing institutional landscape. The fact that you may want a presence of higher education in a particular location does not mean you have to have the institutional configuration that you currently have in that location. So we suggest that that is extremely important in the future to guide future policy. On the tuition fees, as we've said, we suggest, in fact, a differentiated system of tuition fees, which would then allow some funding to be freed up and transferred to increase support for those most in need in higher education. That essentially means higher tuition fees for those most able to pay. And we also call on a review for the Ensino SUPERIOR program, which is the program that supports students to study in regions of low demographic demand, because we have not seen an evaluation of that program, and we would be very interested to understand more about the exact impact that has achieved, and whether the questions and the considerations about mobility that Anna talked about are reflected in that, what has been achieved with that program. And finally, we think that there is scope to both look at a more rational system for ensuring student support is equal or of equal standard across, not student support, student services are of equal standard across the system, and to look at, in certain cases, in particular the big cities, how you can have cooperation between institutions for the provision of student support, which at the moment in some cases is quite limited. So those are in fact, those are the key recommendations we had, and apologies for it taking slightly longer than we had anticipated, but we're now very happy to take questions that you might have regarding any of the aspects that we've presented.
Good afternoon. Do you prefer that I speak in English, I imagine, although you're good in Portuguese? Well, my question is simple. You talked about basic funding, performance agreement funding. Which amount of the total funding do you think that should be linked to the performance agreements that would be made with the higher education institutions? What is the international practice in this area?
Yeah, thanks. The consensus, I think, quite a number of systems have experimented with institutional agreements over time, and some have not linked any funding to them. They've simply had them as what one might call a steering or a contextual policy that's about dialogue and so on. But where the systems that have linked funding, and here what we're talking about is what we've called strategic development funding, and also here there's also the question of adjustment funding. So if we talk about just strategic development funding, we have models between around 2 and 10%, basically. We do recognize that you have a system where what you're seeking to do here is ring fence or earmark some money that goes above and beyond what's needed to just run institutions on a day-to-day basis, right? So the amount of spare resources that you're going to have is most likely quite limited. But equally, there's no need for a large amount of funds to be linked for these sorts of systems to have some effect. That's the lesson from international policy. The amount of money available is just a crucial question. So we are very conscious in making these kind of recommendations. It's important to be realistic. So we suggest thinking around the 5% mark or so on. What you have in addition in our recommendations is this adjustment funding. And again, we can't make exact recommendations there. We just believe that it's important to have a stream of funding that is for that purpose, which is to say the adjustment within institutions that require that.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You talk about a new vision for the higher education system, and taking into account, obviously, the problems that exist at the moment, such as demography, regional problems, academic careers that have to be more flexible. But I would like to hear you a little bit on the drivers of this new vision. What at European level are we actually aiming at in terms of a stronger and newer higher education system? And does this involve science in particular, and how funding is being attributed to science? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think if we highlight a few things, there is definitely, which are related to issues that we have talked about quite a bit in what we presented. One of them is the diversification, so widening of access to post-secondary learning, that we, given what we know about the way the economy is developing, the best bet is to continue to invest in knowledge and skills, essentially. So there is a case for continuing to broaden access, and there, I think, some forms of target would not be bad in terms of probably solutions for those completing vocationally or vocational tracks in upper secondary. What is appropriate type of post-secondary learning for those people? We fully recognize it's not about getting all of those people into bachelor's degrees, because that's not, you want to maintain the level of the bachelor's degree, but there is a solution to be found for those vocational students. There is about the adult learning, the upskilling and reskilling element that is clearly very important. Anna mentioned the issue of there are still pockets of those in secondary education completing scientific humanistic track who are not going to higher education. Why is that? There's still some, I think, targets to be set there. You're absolutely right that the link between research, we come from, this is a curse of higher education, that people either come from education or research, right? So we do I in particular come from the education side, but what we do say in the report is in particular in developing excellence, there's a clear link between programs of excellence and research of excellence and scientific basis, and that I think that the research base and the knowledge development base that is supporting the programmatic offer, or perhaps the connection with local public service or local regional activity that is, or our businesses, that is supporting some of the more practice-oriented or professionally oriented offering, that those things are also things that I would see. So in a national strategy, you can start thinking about orientations. We want to do more of this in general, but then it has to be translated at each individual locality and institution. Do you want to?
Yeah, then maybe to complement that, I think an important point is the coherence of the system. So this is not a system that is decided top-down, centrally. It needs to be decided with a broad agreement, and this requires taking stock of the system that you have today and the demographic challenges that you face. So what is realistic for the moment that you're facing, and taking stock from what the system is. So going forward, this requires the willingness of all parties involved into this new national agreement for a more coherent system, a system that is accessible to people from all socioeconomic backgrounds, both in terms of physical accessibility and then other types of accessibility, like we've mentioned, all across the country, that is of high quality, and that is coherent also with the research profile of institutions.
May I? Can I speak? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. In some way, it's a continuation of the last question. I want to. But it's more about a subsector. It's about the third cycle, or about the PhD studies, because you show one slide. But I want to know, first thing, it's how our situation compare with European and OCDE countries, and also. Which model you can propose for the allocation of resources to the PhD programs? Thank you.
How does it compare with other places? How does it compare to other places?
I mean, I think in terms of we talk there rather mechanically, right, about production of graduates at the master's and bachelor level, but equally if we think about production of doctoral graduates, that Portugal it's another area, of course, where Portugal has expanded quite considerably in recent decades, and has essentially, should we say, between inverted commas, converged to around the OECD average. I think I'm right in saying, in terms of the doctoral production. The organization of the system, there are strengths in the system. I mean, the establishment of research centers in Portugal, so within institutions, but sometimes across institutions, does create quite a flexible model for organization of research and linked to that organization of doctoral training. I think we don't have we don't have like a prescriptive model in terms of doctoral schools or particular approaches, although there are a number of things, and Anna is more expert probably than me on some of this, but there are clear benefits. I think we have evidence about the benefits of cohort effect for doctoral training, and the connection to other doctoral training, which means a certain level of a certain research base and a certain level of critical mass in doctoral training is very important. We do have some evidence about that. So what your networked system, so with research centers, in some cases networked across institutions, does create opportunities to exploit within doctoral education, and that's something to build in. But I guess our view is fundamentally good doctoral education requires good researchers to support and to supervise the doctoral graduates, and it requires typically access for doctoral students or doctoral candidates to peers and others in a cohort, to even if that cohort is slightly dispersed, to generate the excellent experience. There's very limited, shall we say, really hard evidence on particular practices of doctoral training and outcomes, but the general trends we observe in, shall we say, between some of the more advanced systems is to concentrate in doctoral schools and to have that kind of approach. I don't know, as a...
No, I would just add to what you said. The part on international agreements is very important. So not thinking of only of the national system, but a system that is internationalized and trying to gain some of these bigger network effects also from abroad. So that's a key component to excellency.
So this European universities approach, for good or what, we will see where that goes, right? But there are opportunities within that probably to also have that international networking effect.
Yeah. Hello, thank you both for your presentation. I'm Artur Santoalha from the Ministry of Science. And I would like to ask you a question related to something you mentioned. You mentioned that we need more money for higher education and that there is a good case to invest in higher education because this will increase the efficiency of the system. But could you please be more explicit about the possible positive externalities related to the possible implementation of some of these recommendations for the society as a whole, for families, for students, because I guess this would be important to convince the society that higher education would be a priority, and it would be important to devote a higher share of the government budget to this purpose. Thank you.
I think you have two levels of argument. One is about if we pursue the question of widening participation and widening access, and that's an explicit goal with clear social and economic justification, that supporting that's one. That's the kind of in a sense, the widening to a greater proportion of society for skills development and knowledge development. That's one aspect. The other one is the efficiency side. I mean, because you're talking about positive externalities. I mean, the other thing, I think having a very clear plan and having a realistic plan which acknowledges acknowledges also challenge and acknowledges, for example, situations where institutions essentially will need to become, in certain areas, smaller. In certain areas may need to work together with others, that may need to be reconfigured, that discussion is one that's difficult, but one that needs to be had. And that I just think that helps to some extent to say, well, we are trying to put this part of our society that has an extremely important role in knowledge and skills on a more sound footing, on a more future-oriented footing. That is an argument. When you say about the person, I mean, the positive externalities of higher education in general are quite well documented in terms of research output, in terms of skills output, knowledge output, in terms of citizen participation, and so on. I mean, we're talking about that. That's what I meant from the widening access, bringing that to a wider section of population. I suppose my argument is to say that we've been saying that forever, right? It doesn't, but we. It's true, but I think you also need to be saying, and we're also making the most efficient use of these resources that you're going to give us by putting the system on a more rational footing in certain areas.
Yeah, to that I would add also realizing from another perspective, if you have plans for your sectoral specialization, your strategic sectors moving forward, plus all the sectors of social services that have to be provided for societal well-being, higher education underpins a lot of the skills development that this requires. So, matching those two, you cannot have a strong vision of moving to strategic sectors and providing all the services you need without educating the part of the population that needs to provide the very important human capital to underpin those sectors. So that I would believe is also a very strong point for the continued investment in higher education.
Yeah, both the private sector, so the strategic sectors that Portugal wants to develop, and the region, different regions, that varies, but also the public services, of course. Yep. The public services that rely on highly trained human capital, that's very important. And obviously the health service, social care, and so on, which are going to be of greater importance in the future. Many examples of showing what happens if you don't invest adequately in human capital to go into those public services.
Hi. I have a specific question regarding requirements. You said that tuition fees were the same in Portugal for everybody, but regarding to requirements, changes in the requirements, for instance, defining specific requirements for polytechnics and different requirements for universities, would this be, in Portugal's case, of course, would this make a difference in attracting more students to specific universities or polytechnics institutes, for instance? Would this make sense for Portugal? Because this is made in other countries, and I would like to know if it could be a possibility to improve the system here in Portugal. Thank you.
Very good question.
It's a very good question, but it's not one to which there is an easy answer. Differentiated fees, I mean, most systems in there are obviously examples of differentiated fees between fields of study and types of education, but typically, well, should we say, in some more recent reforms which have reformed tuition fees in some certain systems, they have avoided differentiation. There's an exception, which is Australia, which has gone down a very particular road, and not necessarily one that we would recommend. But because it's very difficult to it starts making judgments about the social value of different programs, and essentially there there is cross-subsidy because certain a medical program costs a lot more than a program in economics, and I think it's quite hard for government to make very clear choices about that. So in a sense, having a standard fee, and also, for example, between polytechnic and university. I mean, if you have the notion of a bachelor degree and a master's degree, and you have those provided in different forms but of equal value, right? Then it's hard to start justifying distinct differences. In some systems, there are people look at the earnings outcomes and so on, or you say we need more nurses, so we're going to make it free for nurses, but not other types. But I think it's a very difficult area to then start making the real justifications for those choices. Just as an analyst, I would struggle in making some of those decisions. So my observation from a lot of systems, whether that's the Netherlands or the UK, or they have ultimately stuck with a unitary price because it's easier to communicate and it's easier to handle, even if there are underlying some inequities within that.
Yeah, I guess more something that we couldn't do within the context of our study, but that is very important maybe from analyzing from data, is if these requirements maybe are too strenuous and are excluding what parts of the population. So it could be that, they're unnecessarily high. And especially if this is affecting with a bias, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, this could be something that should be looked into. So what is the relationship between the requirements versus entry, and how this is differentiated across different socioeconomic backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about differentiation between types of provision. Obviously, within social background, which is actually what we do say that in terms of ability to pay, because there is quite good evidence for low socioeconomic, about financial barriers for low socioeconomic groups. Equally, however, there is, beyond a certain quite low level of income, there is very little impact of having tuition fees on participation. The UK, England, is a clear example of that, the diversity of student participations, with now really very high by international standards fees, has actually increased. There's various reasons for that, but there is no clear relationship between beyond a certain baseline level of participation and fee level. So it's quite a complex area, but yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. I'm getting a sign that we should be closing off. So we thank you very much for your attention, both people in the room and online.
Thank you very much.
Para encerrar a sessão, começo por dar a palavra a Luís Loures, representante do Conselho Coordenador dos Institutos Superiores Politécnicos e presidente do Instituto Politécnico de Porto Alegre.
Muito boa tarde a todos. Permitam-me que cumprimente a Sra. Ministra, a professora Elvira Fortunato, e que na sua pessoa e na pessoa do Sr. Secretário de Estado, o professor Pedro Teixeira, cumprimento todos os presentes. A verdade é que já percebemos pela apresentação que o relatório é denso, é longo, são umas longas 170 páginas, com muita informação, e a verdade é que não tivemos, ao nível do Conselho Coordenador, tempo de reunir e discutir o relatório em profundidade, e naturalmente com a profundidade que uma reflexão desta natureza exige, não é? Mas, de qualquer maneira, notámos alguns aspectos muito positivos relativamente àquilo que é a referência que é feita à evolução positiva do sistema de ensino superior português nos últimos anos, o que é sempre assinalável. Ainda assim, nós temos, em relação a alguns dados, temos algumas reservas e consideramos que algumas das premissas que são utilizadas nem sempre estão alinhadas com aquela que é a realidade das regiões e também com aquela que é a realidade das instituições de ensino superior portuguesas. Por isso, de uma forma geral e numa apreciação muito diagonal do estudo, importa, no nosso entendimento, apresentar algumas considerações que nos parecem fundamentais relativamente àquilo que são os aspectos-chave apresentados neste relatório. Em primeiro lugar, consideramos que ele está orientado por uma visão muito interna do sistema, que, a ser implementada, poderá contribuir para reduzir aquilo que nós entendemos que é fundamental, que é a cooperação institucional. E digo isto porque, efetivamente, de acordo com aquilo que também é referenciado pelo relatório como uma boa prática, que foram os contratos de legislatura, algo que permitiu estabelecer uma relação de maior cooperação entre as instituições e entre as instituições e a tutela, tem que ver efetivamente com a capacidade de sabermos com aquilo que se conta e com a perspectiva apresentada inicialmente de se garantir mais fundos para o ensino superior, sem criar com isso guerras internas que normalmente contribuem para dividir o sistema. Neste sentido, parece-nos que algumas das propostas apresentadas contrariam de forma clara aquilo que efetivamente tem sido discutido com as instituições de ensino superior, relativamente e com a tutela, que nos parece que esta fórmula, ou aquilo que é a fórmula de financiamento, embora seja necessária, deverá obrigatoriamente passar por um aumento da dotação global de orçamento, sem que daí advenham reduções de orçamento para as instituições. E aquilo que nós vemos em algumas das propostas apresentadas, até com prazos relativos àquilo que é a adaptação, implicariam necessidades de reajustamento nas instituições, que é preciso perceber como é que se fazem, e também o impacto que elas teriam, não só para as instituições, mas também para as regiões onde as instituições se inserem. E por isso, não nos parece que uma estratégia ou uma forma de financiamento que venha a ser implementada, que tenha por base uma lógica de tirar a uns para dar a outros, vá contribuir para fortalecer o sistema. Antes, pelo contrário, pensamos que esta metodologia pode contribuir para fragilizar o sistema e contribuir para maiores divisões. Também, outra das grandes questões deste relatório prende-se, na nossa opinião, com se calhar a falta concreta de uma visão estratégica para a resolução daquilo que é o subfinanciamento do ensino superior. Todos falamos, e é reconhecido a nível nacional, aquilo que é o subfinanciamento do ensino superior. Esta é uma evidência amplamente difundida, mas que não é abordada de forma crítica no sistema, especialmente quando nós temos aqui um conjunto de 33 recomendações. Esta questão assume ainda um maior destaque num período em que se pretende, simultaneamente, aumentar o valor global do investimento em ensino superior, ao mesmo tempo que se continua a reduzir o déficit público. E por isso é preciso perceber de onde é que vem o dinheiro, como é que ele vem, porque ele é fundamental, e esta é uma questão crítica que não é abordada e que nos parece fundamental na decisão de qualquer proposta de modelo de financiamento do ensino superior. Por outro lado, temos aqui algumas dúvidas e não se consegue perceber bem, ao longo do relatório, um relatório com este pendor estratégico, que não se aborde, por exemplo, o papel das instituições de ensino superior no desenvolvimento social e económico das regiões, sobretudo aquelas que são mais periféricas, e esta lacuna é uma lacuna que é importante, que pode somar aqui àquilo que são algumas das conclusões apresentadas, que são amplamente contrariadas por aquilo que vem no estudo. Porque, por exemplo, se pensarmos na questão da atratividade dos territórios e da capacidade dos territórios de menor densidade demográfica e das instituições situadas nestes territórios atraírem pessoas, é um facto que a maior parte destas instituições de ensino superior em territórios de menor pressão demográfica, especialmente em Portugal continental, têm, ao nível do concurso nacional de acesso, mais de 50% dos seus estudantes oriundos de outros distritos, o que prova de forma indelével aquela que é a capacidade destas instituições de serem um contribuinte líquido para a atratividade desses territórios e com essa contribuição contribuírem também para aquilo que é o desenvolvimento regional, nomeadamente no que diz respeito a empresas e à atração de investimento para estes territórios. E por isso parece-nos um bocadinho estranho que um relatório desta natureza estratégica, e estamos a falar de um relatório denso, são 170 páginas, não aborda estas questões que, na nossa perspectiva, são fundamentais, quer para as instituições, quer para o território. Para além disso, parece-nos efetivamente um erro assumir, e aqui eu vou citar, que se deve evoluir no sentido de concentrar ainda mais as vagas nas grandes áreas metropolitanas, ao mesmo tempo que se encoraja a redução de vagas nas regiões de baixa densidade. Isto está escrito no relatório e eu acho que isto é um erro estratégico e é um erro que, para além de ser estratégico, coloca em causa aquela que tem sido a política nacional ao nível da coesão e do desenvolvimento territorial. E por isso pensamos que medidas como esta, embora possam ser discutidas, terão efetivamente um impacto muito significativo naquelas que são as dinâmicas territoriais do nosso país. De igual modo, parece-nos também um bocadinho redutor que um relatório desta natureza não aborde a capacidade de atração de receitas próprias pelas instituições de ensino superior, sobretudo aquelas que são situadas em Lisboa e no Porto, como um fator específico daquilo que é o financiamento. Porque se estas regiões têm maior capacidade de gerar riqueza, também esse fator devia ser um fator de correção, como acontece noutras formas de financiamento público. Não é preciso ir muito longe, basta pensar no financiamento autárquico, que nós sabemos que, ao nível do FEF, estes aspectos são considerados porque têm a ver com a capacidade que as regiões têm para gerar ou não riqueza. E isso é feito ao nível da correção do orçamento. E por isso também aqui achamos que este seria um aspecto relevante. Por fim, e em jeito de conclusão, dizer que o CISP naturalmente fará chegar uma posição escrita sobre o relatório, porque as 170 páginas são longas, são densas, temos muito trabalho de análise, é um trabalho extremamente minucioso, que, como disse, tem alguns aspectos em que nós conseguimos já verificar algum desvio daquilo que é a realidade, pelo menos conhecida pelas instituições, e por isso o CISP fará chegar à tutela, naturalmente, uma posição escrita sobre os principais dados do relatório e as 33 medidas que são apresentadas. E dizer que fará chegar uma perspectiva, eu não podia estar mais de acordo com o Sr. Secretário de Estado quando refere que esta é uma discussão que não é uma discussão só para as instituições de ensino superior, é uma discussão, eu diria, para o país, para as regiões, para todos os players ativos e, essencialmente, para aqueles cuja vida é afetada diretamente pela existência ou não e pela capacidade de intervenção que as instituições de ensino superior têm sobre os territórios. E é preciso verificar que o impacto das instituições não é diretamente proporcional à sua dimensão. E isso é algo que é importante que seja visto no estudo e que nós tenhamos esta consciência. E vou terminar também fazendo uma pequena provocação, utilizando aqui o que o Sr. Secretário de Estado nos disse, é que eu não me parece que utilizar uma política de Robin dos bosques ao contrário seja aquela que é a solução para o ensino superior em Portugal. Não me parece que tirar a quem tem pouco para dar a quem já tem muito vai resolver o que é que seja ao nível do ensino superior. E não me parece que isso vá ao encontro daquela que é a política nacional e daquela que é a política de desenvolvimento territorial, que nós temos um Ministério para a Coesão, que me parece que, lendo este relatório, pensaria ao mesmo que nós, que estamos em situações de baixa densidade, que ele é bastante perigoso para aquilo que é o financiamento e a sustentabilidade das instituições situadas nestas regiões. Muito obrigado.
Chamo ao púlpito Rui Vieira de Castro, representante do Conselho de Reitores de Universidades Portuguesas e reitor da Universidade do Minho.
Muito boa tarde a todas e a todos, Sra. Ministra, Sr. Secretário de Estado, Sr. Presidente da Academia das Ciências, dear rapporteurs, caros colegas, reitores, presidentes, representantes de várias entidades do nosso sistema científico e tecnológico e cumprimento também aqueles que nos vão seguir à distância. Eu queria começar por clarificar o meu ponto de vista aqui, não é? De que ponto é que eu falo? Estou aqui em representação do Conselho de Reitores. A verdade é que o Conselho de Reitores não teve ainda ocasião de se debruçar sobre o relatório, de modo que eu vou assumir aquela posição sempre delicada e verdadeiramente quase impossível de fazer uma média do pensamento dos meus colegas sobre algumas matérias que aqui são abordadas. Algumas delas têm sido objeto de discussão interna no Conselho de Reitores, outras nem tanto, e portanto há sempre aqui um problema de uma contaminação por um ponto de vista pessoal sobre esta matéria. Eu desde já peço desculpa, sobretudo aos membros do Conselho de Reitores que aqui estão, se por acaso o meu discurso soar desalinhado com aquilo que é o pensamento de cada um. Mas julgo que é inevitável nesta circunstância. Eu queria, entrando mais na substância das coisas, começar por estabelecer duas conexões com as intervenções do Sr. Presidente da Academia das Ciências e do Sr. Secretário de Estado no início desta sessão. A primeira para sublinhar a importância de dispormos de relatórios com estas características, de relatórios que têm, do meu ponto de vista, uma grande qualidade, que é de nos devolver uma representação sistemática, aprofundada, consolidada sobre aspectos essenciais do ensino superior em Portugal, e depois de corroborar também aquilo que disse, é que, enfim, eu diria, infelizmente, nem sempre nós somos capazes de aproveitar adequadamente esta informação que nos é disponibilizada para sobre ela alicerçarmos, sejam as políticas públicas do nosso país, sejam as próprias políticas institucionais. A minha expectativa e a nossa expectativa aqui é que desta vez as coisas aconteçam diferentemente e que, de facto, um relatório com estas características possa ser aproveitado na máxima profundidade. O elo de ligação com a fala inicial do Sr. Secretário de Estado tem a ver com um sublinhado, que é também, do nosso ponto de vista, é importante que se pensem as questões do financiamento no quadro mais geral da reflexão sobre o ensino superior em Portugal, sobre aquilo que o país quer que o seu ensino superior seja, sobre aquilo que o país quer que as suas instituições universitárias ou politécnicas sejam. Portanto, estas são orientações que de alguma forma vou ter presentes na minha intervenção subsequente. Queria, de facto, elogiar o exercício que o MESTES desencadeou. Desencadeou o Ministro Manuel Leitor, a Sra. Ministra Elvira Fortunato prosseguiu um exercício centrado naquela que é claramente uma componente crítica do nosso sistema, o financiamento do ensino superior. O professor Pedro Teixeira há bocado disse, as conversas em torno do ensino superior invariavelmente vão bater na questão do financiamento. Esta é, de facto, uma componente crítica, é uma criticidade comum a muitos outros sistemas, mas que no caso concreto parece ter algumas especificidades. Eu diria que uma dessas especificidades, pouco interessante, tem sido a sua não transparência. Pela primeira vez este ano, e eu tenho dito isso publicamente, temos dito isso publicamente e queremos reconhecê-lo, se deu um passo muito significativo no sentido de aumentar a transparência que deve, do nosso ponto de vista, estar sempre subjacente a um exercício tão importante quanto é o da atribuição de orçamento às instituições de ensino superior. Se esse é um pecado, se esta especialidade é um pecado, há um outro pecado também, que é a de que o financiamento tem sido insensível às transformações nas instituições de ensino superior e ao seu impacto. E isto tem um efeito terrível em termos de eficiência, que é que se alguém faz mal, como sabe que tem garantidos determinados recursos, continua a fazer mal. Quem procura fazer melhor, ao perceber que desse fazer melhor não resultam vantagens, abdica de procurar fazer melhor. E, portanto, deste ponto de vista, parece-me que estas especificidades devem ser consideradas e devem ser corrigidas. Este facto, aliás, tem trazido grandes tensões para dentro do sistema de ensino superior em Portugal. Tensões entre os subsistemas, e hoje vive-se um ambiente muito pouco saudável na relação entre o subsistema universitário e o subsistema politécnico, mas também tensões internas aos próprios subsistemas. E tudo isto faz com que muitas vezes as instituições comecem a funcionar quase em modo de sobrevivência, que é um dos piores modos de funcionar, porque retira distanciamento crítico, retira capacidade analítica, com efeitos que são perversos para o próprio sistema. Esta situação que está registada no relatório de um desalinhamento entre financiamento e estudantes inscritos, para identificar um dos alinhamentos que foram, aliás, mencionados hoje aqui, é algo que evidentemente nos deve preocupar e preocupar profundamente e, sobretudo, levar a medidas corretivas que, eu diria, ainda bem, foram já iniciadas. Portanto, primeiro o elogio, depois a valorização da estratégia adotada no relatório. A consideração do contexto parece absolutamente essencial para se poder desenhar uma estratégia para o futuro do sistema em Portugal e para a associação a esse futuro daquilo que se pretende que seja o modelo de financiamento das instituições. E aqui, eu julgo que o relatório confronta-nos, e isso foi feito também já aqui hoje, com um dado que é fundamental e que tem a ver com a crise demográfica em que estamos mergulhados e que vai afetar de forma muito decisiva aquilo que vai ser o futuro das instituições. Esta consideração do contexto passa também pelo reconhecimento daquilo que são os bons resultados, ou os grandes resultados obtidos pelo sistema de ensino superior português, que têm levado a transformações muito significativas no nosso contexto social, no nosso contexto económico e, portanto, há razões para estarmos satisfeitos com aquilo que fizemos, mas também este ponto a que chegamos compromete-nos e responsabiliza-nos perante desenvolvimentos futuros que têm que vir a ser realizados. Desse ponto de vista, eu julgo que, e esta é uma matéria que tem sido também discutida no âmbito do Conselho de Reitores, que a questão da reconfiguração do sistema tem que ser colocada em cima da mesa. O relatório aponta em diversos sentidos que de alguma forma acabam por confluir neste exercício que mais tarde ou mais cedo vamos ter que fazer, e se o exercício puder ser controlado pelas instituições e pelo poder político, tanto melhor. Se para ele formos arrastados num quadro de inevitabilidade, pois certamente que isso não será interessante para ninguém. A especialização das instituições é uma recomendação clara no relatório. Isso vem sendo já objeto de algumas, tematizações nas políticas, nos enunciados de política pública em Portugal nesta área. Era importante perceber se é por aqui que queremos ir ou se queremos ir por outro lugar. Se queremos apontar no sentido da especialização ou se queremos apontar no sentido da indiferenciação. E, desse ponto de vista, a posição do grupo é clara. Iniciativas como aquelas que estão neste momento em debate na Assembleia da República sobre as alterações das designações das instituições ou da atribuição do grau de doutor sem mais, desligadas de uma reflexão profunda sobre o que é que queremos do ensino superior, são formas que não nos conduzem a bons pontos de chegada, pelo menos do nosso ponto de vista. Nesta perspectiva, parece-nos importante que este relatório é mais um elemento de grande importância para a discussão da necessária reorganização do sistema de ensino superior em Portugal. A senhora Ministra já exprimiu a sua vontade de colocar muito proximamente na agenda a revisão do regime jurídico das instituições de ensino superior, e certamente que o grupo acompanhará muito e participará ativamente nesse debate, mas esta, de facto, julgamos que estamos num tempo em que esta reflexão mais estratégica sobre o ensino superior se nos impõe por múltiplas razões, requerendo um exercício que pode até ser penoso para nós, para as instituições, que é uma visão muito realista sobre aquilo que são as nossas circunstâncias e sobre aquilo que são os futuros que podemos antecipar. Deixava apenas, se me permitirem ainda, algumas notas finais a propósito de várias das recomendações que são feitas no quadro do relatório. A primeira, para elogiar os princípios que são convocados para suportar a construção do novo modelo de dotação orçamental. Princípio da transparência, princípio da equidade, princípio da eficiência. Ficou patente, e está patente no relatório também, ficou hoje patente aqui na apresentação, como a não adoção destes princípios conduziu objetivamente a situações iníquas no interior do sistema de ensino superior. E isto não devia acontecer. Não devia acontecer porque isso traduziu-se em prejuízos gravíssimos para várias instituições. Não é um prejuízo de um ano nem de 2 anos, é um prejuízo de vários anos. E eu esperaria, e agora, se me permitem uma palavra quase como reitor da Universidade do Minho, vou por um momento abdicar da minha condição de representante aqui do Conselho de Reitores, dizer-vos que há efeitos muito gravosos sobre as instituições que foram penalizadas pela não existência, pela não operação efetiva destes princípios de transparência e de equidade. Os dados que foram mostrados relativamente àquilo que representa o investimento por estudante nas várias instituições, e este nem é sequer um problema dos subsistemas, porque existem grandes discrepâncias dentro do subsistema universitário, como dizem, dentro do subsistema politécnico. Esta é uma questão que tem que ser endereçada de forma urgente pelos nossos responsáveis políticos. Quanto ao modelo de financiamento, a diferenciação entre financiamento base e financiamento estratégico parece-nos uma boa opção. Parece-nos claramente uma boa opção, como também aquela que o Simon referiu relativamente à composição da componente de financiamento base com uma subcomponente fixa e uma subcomponente variável. Parece-nos também que, face ao que é o histórico recente, a adoção deste modelo, mas sobre isso, e do modelo baseado numa fórmula, sobre isso também a Sra. Ministra se tem pronunciado, ela deve constituir uma prioridade. O compromisso assumido de que nós, em 2024, teremos já um orçamento construído sobre uma outra base, cria, de facto, expectativas muito grandes para as instituições, sobretudo para as universidades. Há uma nota no relatório que parece também importante, mas que se relaciona com esta perspectivação mais global deste problema e que tem a ver com o recurso à ponderação de outros instrumentos, designadamente aqueles que depois podem ter expressão nos próprios estatutos de carreira, de gestão do tempo dos docentes. Julgo que temos que caminhar no sentido de uma maior flexibilização destes instrumentos para que as instituições possam, por um lado, ter efetivamente maior autonomia e possam também interpretar melhor aquilo que é a sua missão, própria. Há pouco reportei-me à reorganização do sistema de ensino superior. Esta reorganização, julgo que não tem que passar, e disso também temos discutido, e temos, aliás, experiências no âmbito do CRUP, elas não têm que passar necessariamente pela fusão de instituições ou pela extinção de instituições, podem ter outras modalidades muito produtivas, e a referência à organização em rede das instituições, que aparece também como proposta no relatório, é uma possibilidade que devíamos ser capazes de explorar. Última nota da minha parte, último comentário sobre a questão dos estudantes, a proteção aos estudantes, que é objeto também de ponderação no relatório. Nós temos uma situação um pouco particular no nosso país. Os valores da Bolsa são relativamente baixos, embora tenham vindo a conhecer valorizações com expressão importante. a percentagem de bolseiros é também ela relativamente baixa, acrescendo a tudo isto que nós temos uma grande disparidade interna ao próprio país. E é interessante, um dos quadros, porventura, mais interessantes que neste particular relatório nos traz, é aquele que permite comparar o esforço que as instituições fazem para apoiar os seus estudantes através dos serviços de ação social, verificado o facto de as transferências que são feitas do Estado para as instituições não serem, desse ponto de vista, suficientes. É uma matéria que também, evidentemente, deve e merecerá em contínuo a nossa atenção. Em síntese, eu diria que estamos perante um instrumento muito útil para o conhecimento da realidade portuguesa, para a definição de políticas e para a definição, sobretudo também, de políticas institucionais. Cria-se uma base de confiança importante, há uma base factual muito relevante que permitirá colocar, penso que em novas bases, o necessário diálogo entre todos aqueles que atuam e interatuam no quadro do ensino superior. E por isso, uma vez mais, aos relatores agradeço o trabalho que foi feito, à Sra. Ministra agradeço a iniciativa que foi tomada e que agora certamente terá desenvolvimentos importantes futuros. Muito obrigado.
Dou a palavra à Ministra da Ciência, Tecnologia e Ensino Superior, Elvira Fortunato.
Muito boa tarde. Before starting, I just would like to acknowledge the quality of the report that was given, and also I'd like to congratulate Simon Roy and Ana Moreno for the work done. And this is, especially in the days that we are facing today, the situation that we are facing today, I guess this is it is in a crucial moment. Excelentíssimo Secretário de Estado do Ensino Superior, Pedro Nuno Teixeira, Excelentíssimo Presidente da Academia das Ciências, José Luís Cardoso, Excelentíssimo Representante do Conselho de Reitores das Universidades Portuguesas, Rui Vieira de Castro, Excelentíssimo Representante do Conselho de Coordenador dos Institutos Superiores Politécnicos, Luís Loures, restantes convidados, senhoras e senhores. Esta sessão assume particular relevância para mim e para o meu colega Secretário de Estado, Pedro Nuno Teixeira, e para a nossa equipa ministerial. Desde que tomámos posse, que definimos como prioridade a revisão do modelo de financiamento das instituições do ensino superior, tomando a fórmula de financiamento mais justa. Uma fórmula que garanta estabilidade e previsibilidade à comunidade académica e seja subordinada a objetivos de eficiência, equidade e qualidade no ensino superior. Aliás, este ano estamos exatamente a celebrar os 50 anos da reforma de Veiga Simão e penso que é exatamente a altura adequada, passados 50 anos, meio século, para rever exatamente o modelo de financiamento do ensino superior, não só na sua fórmula de financiamento, mas na sua globalidade. Ao longo dos últimos 20 anos, Portugal fez uma trajetória muito positiva em termos de aquisição de qualificações superiores por parte da população que se situa na faixa etária entre os 25 e os 34 anos. Enquanto no ano 2000 a população desta faixa etária com qualificações superiores rondava os 17%, no ano de 2021 este valor já atingia os 47%. Este aumento ficou bastante acima do registado pela OCDE. Aliás, Portugal é um dos países da OCDE onde este aumento foi mais expressivo ao longo do período de referência, encontrando-se também entre os países onde este nível de ensino é o mais comum para aquela faixa etária. Apesar desta evolução muito substancial, sabemos que o investimento no ensino superior em Portugal está abaixo da média dos países da OCDE. Apesar de, entre 2017 e 2021, o financiamento oriundo do Orçamento do Estado, destinado às instituições de ensino públicas, ter aumentado 15% em termos nominais. Sabemos que há 3 questões essenciais nesta discussão: aumentar o volume de financiamento, definir um modelo de financiamento com critérios claros e prospectivos e não apenas históricos, como tem sido feito até aqui, e assegurar que o financiamento promove a estabilidade no sistema de ensino superior. No que se refere ao volume de financiamento, para além de, em 2023, as dotações de receitas de impostos atribuídas a instituições de ensino superior crescerem 3,7% face a 2022, o que se traduziu num acréscimo de 44 milhões de euros nas dotações base, o Governo tem feito um acompanhamento atento do impacto da inflação na atividade das instituições de ensino superior, atuando sempre de modo a manter equilibrados os seus orçamentos. Foi nesse contexto que se procedeu ao reforço de 25 milhões de euros nas instituições de ensino superior, principalmente para compensar estas instituições do acréscimo de custos de energia. Este valor corresponde a um reforço efetivo de 2 pontos percentuais às dotações já atribuídas. É importante também recordar nesta discussão que o investimento público colocado no ensino superior não se resume às dotações provenientes do Orçamento de Estado. A par destas, as políticas públicas têm direcionado para as instituições de ensino superior financiamento proveniente de diversas outras fontes, designadamente financiamentos atribuídos pela Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia ao desenvolvimento de projetos de investigação, formação avançada, emprego científico e atividade institucional das unidades de ID integradas nas próprias instituições de ensino superior. Financiamento dos cursos técnicos superiores profissionais através de fundos comunitários e fundos nacionais. Financiamento dos programas Impulso Jovens, STEAM, e Impulso Adultos através do PRR. Financiamento dos programas de modernização e inovação pedagógica e promoção de sucesso escolar e saúde mental. Financiamento das operações de construção, aquisição, adequação e renovação de residências para estudantes de ensino superior financiadas no quadro do PNAES. Se por um lado é verdade que desde essa altura temos vindo a reforçar o financiamento das instituições de ensino superior por via do Orçamento de Estado, também é verdade que desde 2009, ano em que a fórmula de financiamento foi aplicada pela última vez, temos verificado um progressivo desalinhamento entre o financiamento atribuído e os números reais de inscritos nas instituições de ensino superior. Nestes poucos meses de mandato, houve um esforço para que a alocação do financiamento refletisse já essas preocupações. Assim, na negociação do OE de 2023, foi feito um primeiro exercício de convergência com a aplicação da fórmula de financiamento. 1% do acréscimo às dotações base para 2023 foi atribuído exclusivamente às 15 instituições que se encontravam abaixo do valor que corresponderia pela metodologia corretiva adotada para o financiamento. E a nenhuma se retirou nenhum orçamento. E o apoio ao acréscimo de custos com a energia foi distribuído pelas instituições com base no peso dos alunos ponderados de cada instituição no total do sistema, o mesmo indicador utilizado para efeitos da fórmula de financiamento. No que se refere à definição de um novo modelo de financiamento, concordamos obviamente com a recomendação da OCDE de implementar um modelo em que a alocação das dotações base atribuídas seja feita com base numa fórmula com indicadores conhecidos e mensuráveis. Concordamos também que a fórmula integra em si uma componente fixa, idêntica para todas as instituições, e uma componente variável que dependa do número de estudantes, entre outros indicadores a considerar. No que se refere à estabilidade do sistema, os últimos anos foram caracterizados por um esforço para contratualizar as relações financeiras entre o Governo e as instituições de ensino superior, consubstanciado em 2 contratos de legislatura, os quais criaram perspectivas de estabilidade e de previsibilidade e que foram muito importantes para o sistema de ensino superior. Deste modo, gostaríamos também de destacar, entre as recomendações apresentadas no relatório da OCDE, que também nos parece muito pertinente a ideia de que o financiamento base seja complementado com contratos de programa institucionais específicos e plurianuais, para orientar a sua missão e especialização, assim como a própria diversificação do sistema. Isso pode e deve ser concretizado através de uma contratualização plurianual com objetivos prioritários de política pública que respeitem e promovam a autonomia e a reflexão estratégica das instituições num quadro de contratos-programa a celebrar com cada instituição e que complementem as dotações base a atribuir por fórmula e que atendam às especificidades territoriais, sociais e demográficas onde desenvolvem a sua atividade. Tendo em conta esta análise e tendo por objetivo os 3 grandes princípios subjacentes ao Orçamento de Estado para este ano, e repito, estabilidade, confiança e compromisso, definimos como urgente o desenvolvimento de um novo modelo de financiamento que privilegie o desempenho das instituições de ensino superior, potenciando os efeitos de um modelo de financiamento claro e transparente para todas as instituições públicas, que facilite o planeamento plurianual da governação e gestão e que contenha os estímulos adequados para promover o seu bom desempenho e, assim, incentivar o melhor cumprimento das suas missões institucionais. Pretendemos que o novo modelo de financiamento tenha em conta critérios transversais ao sistema e inclua uma dimensão de contratualização em que valorizamos o contexto de cada instituição, as questões de internacionalização, de interioridade, de insularidade, indicadores científicos, entre outras variáveis, sem nunca perder de vista a diversidade do sistema que é preciso preservar. Tendo em vista a sua aplicação no quadro do Orçamento de Estado 2024, o novo modelo de financiamento será enquadrado num conjunto programático mais amplo, ao qual estão associadas outras fontes de financiamento para além do Orçamento de Estado e a implementação de outras medidas relevantes para o sistema de ensino superior que serão vertidas no novo contrato de legislatura que, findo o atual, apoia o planeamento estratégico e plurianual das instituições de ensino superior públicas. Apesar de considerarmos que a atribuição de financiamento apenas com base do histórico não se coaduna com os objetivos de promover a qualidade e estimular o desempenho das instituições, não podemos desconsiderar que existe um histórico, existem contextos e missões diferenciadas e as alterações a introduzir serão realizadas sempre de modo gradual, evitando provocar perturbação no sistema pelo ajustamento que terá de ocorrer. Agora que recebemos por parte da OCDE este relatório, iniciaremos desde já um debate que envolverá todas as instituições de ensino superior através de um processo participado, transparente e promotor de estímulos ao desenvolvimento do ensino superior, que determinará quais as recomendações a serem implementadas. Estou convicta que após essa discussão reuniremos todas as condições para proceder à modernização do modelo de financiamento atualmente vigente. Muito boa tarde.
Agradeço a todos a presença nesta sessão. Convido-vos para um lanche que está servido na varanda, que está assinalada e cujas indicações serão dadas pela colega Mafalda Jardim. Obrigada.